How are we doing, everybody? It's Coach Alex from Maximize Potential coming at y'all with another great Mobility Monday. This week we're going to be covering another overuse wrist injury, carpal tunnel syndrome. I'll talk a little bit about what it is, why it happens, how we can prevent it, and a couple of different ways that we can treat it. But before we get into that, if you haven't noticed, our cold weather gear is finally here. Stay bundled up and stay warm while still getting your gains. We've got sweaters, we've got sweatpants, we've got beanies, and we've got a good assortment of hoodies. We still got a handful of deals going on right now. So go ahead and grab some stuff while the deals are still on. I'm gonna go ahead and leave a link down in the comments below. Today we're talking about carpal tunnel syndrome. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. This week we're covering another very common overuse wrist injury. Last week we spoke a little bit about tennis elbow, which involves a lot of the extensors in the top of the forearm. This week I wanted to look at the flip side of the coin and check out the flexors, more specifically the carpal tunnel. Now, just as a little bit of an anatomy lesson, the carpal tunnel is a narrow passageway that's surrounded by bones, ligaments, and muscles on the palm side of the hand. Now, we've got a rather large nerve that runs right in between there called the median nerve. Now, when the nerve that runs through that carpal tunnel is under repeated pressure or squeezed by tendons in the wrist, it can result in carpal tunnel syndrome. As you can imagine, a lot of these symptoms are going to be very nerve related. So, the feeling of swelling fingers even though your fingers may not be swollen, shocks that may temporarily come and go in your fingers and your thumb, or weakening in our grip strength, which makes it hard for us to make a fist. Now, carpal tunnel is most common in individuals who perform any kind of repetitive task involving the hands. So lots of the time this means people who work a lot on the computer, who drive a car a lot, or who work with smaller instruments. Now, if some of us fall into that category, but we're not yet feeling any of these symptoms, here are a couple of tips to prevent it all the way around. Focus on keeping your hands in line with your forearms. Often we find ourselves angling our wrists in whenever we're typing on a computer or using a mouse. Now, this puts some stress on some of those tendons and ligaments, which over time can cause certain weaknesses and overstretching. Now, if we work at a computer very often, stay aware of that wrist alignment and possibly invest in a keyboard or a mouse pad. Now, that pad is going to allow support for the wrist and keep our wrists in line while typing. We also want to make sure that our workstation is nice and centered to ourselves and low enough to where your forearms stay parallel or slightly lower with the ground. This being said, stay away from putting your computer or your workstation directly on your laps or legs. And finally, remember to take breaks. If you have a job that requires repetitive motion, try and take a small break every 15 to 20 minutes. This can be as simple as walking away and grabbing some water and just shaking out the hands. But for those of us who may have some of these symptoms or know that we already have carpal tunnel syndrome, I'm going to show us exactly what we have to get into to go ahead and treat that. Alright, so as I mentioned, a lot of the issues that are going to arise from this are going to be centered around that median nerve. Now, whenever the tissues surrounding that nerve become inflamed or not so happy, they're going to bump into that nerve and we're going to get some nerve pain down into the hands. So step number one here is going to be to mediate the pain, mediate that inflammation, and we're going to do that with some myofascial release. So I personally like to use a lacrosse ball, but we absolutely can use a half roller. If we don't have a half roller, we can use a thermos, and even better if it's ice cold. So very simple, we're going to go ahead and take that lacrosse ball and we're going to place it just below the watch line. Now this is kind of why I like to leave my bracelets or my watches on, just so this way we can show a little bit of a marker. Now anything higher than this is going to be a lot more bone, and as we know, anytime we get into any type of myofascia, we don't want to be directly on any bone. So taking that ball onto the table, now we're going to drive that hand, that forearm, straight into the table here, adding a little bit of pressure. Now, as we roll around, we're going to find a couple of spots that might be a little bit tender. Now, when we do, sit on it, put a little bit of extra pressure, maybe some small circles. We'll go 20 to 30 seconds. Now, I really like extending out the hands. Now, what this is going to do is stretch each individual tendon that not only runs through the tunnel, but that comes and attaches to each finger. So, find a spot, put a little bit of extra pressure in there, and extend those fingers out. Now, if we get any bit of nerve pain here, ease off of that area, find a different spot. We don't want to make that nerve any angrier than what it may be. So let's go ahead and find about 2 or 3 different spots, focusing about 20 to 30 seconds on each. Great, so now that our muscles are a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more flexible, we can get into a stretch. So we're going to go ahead and do a very simple 3-way flexor stretch. So the way that we're going to get into that is we're going to go ahead and grab that hand and we're going to extend the arm out in front of us. Now, we're slowly going to apply a little bit of pressure until we feel a stretch down the flexors in that arm. Now, like I mentioned, this is going to be a 3-way stretch. So after we find about 15, maybe 20 seconds here, we're going to go ahead and take that hand and point those fingers to the outside. Now, you're going to go ahead and reach underneath or over top, and again, pull towards the shoulder. Should feel a little bit of a different stretch Very similar muscles, but we're hitting it at a different angle. We have a lot going on in this form, so we want to make sure that we go all the way around. Now again, once we hit 15 to 20 seconds, we're going to point that inwards and pull it on in. In total, this should take about 90 seconds. After we finish, go ahead and give yourself a couple of wrist circles. This is just going to bring some life back into that joint. Now, finally, the last one we're going to get into is going to be some strengthening. Now, as I mentioned with carpal tunnel, sometimes we can have that sensation of weakening in our grip or the inability to make a fist. So we're going to get a towel. You can absolutely use a stress ball, maybe even a tennis ball if our grip has gone up to that level. So we want to ball up this towel. Now I just have it kind of rolled up, folded it over a couple of times, and I'm wrapping my hand around this, and I'm just going to squeeze 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10, 9, 10, and once I get there, I'm going to go ahead and relax for 5 seconds. Now I'm going to repeat this about 3 or 4 different times. Squeeze, 2, 3, 4, again, all the way to 10. After we get to 10, release for 5 seconds. This is going to help recondition those muscles and make it to where these muscles no longer have to struggle in order to actually use some strength. Now remember, this is only one side of the arm. We're strengthening out those flexors, but what about the extensors? Now, a lot of the time that carpal tunnel comes from whenever those wrists are cocked down into this downward awkward angle. Now, a lot of the time that can be due to the overstretching or the weakening of the extensor muscles. So we kind of want to get into these extensor muscles. The way that we're going to do that is going to be a couple of extensor curls. Now, the way that we're going to get into these extensor curls, we're going to go ahead and take that effective hand and we're going to hang it off of a table. Now, lightly, you're going to take your opposite hand and place it right up on the top of that hand. Now, we're slowly going to add a little bit of pressure with the top hand as we curl up that hand. Now, you should feel a little bit of tightening in those extensor muscles. We want to go about 3 sets of 15 here. Like I said earlier with the grip strength, this is going to help recondition these muscles and allow us to make sure that we can hold this hand up throughout the entirety of the day. But anyway, y'all, that's about all I got for us today. I hope we learned something new. For those of us suffering from some carpal tunnel issues, go ahead and try some of these out at home and tell me how we feel in the comments. If you have any more questions or would like further intervention, go ahead and book a mobility session with me. I'm going to go ahead and also leave that link down in the comments. Like I mentioned earlier, the cold weather gear is finally here, so go ahead and grab some while those deals are still on. Remember, y'all, this is always a conversation, so don't forget to leave a like, comment down below with anything that you learned, questions that you may have, or suggestions for future content that you want to see. But other than that, I'm Coach Alex. Y'all be good, drink some water. I'll see y'all in the next one.